Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. All week we have been focusing our attention on mental health issues and other psychosocial and media factors that could influence violent behavior. And today we're going to sort of talk about probably what I would consider the elephant in the room as it relates to this whole discussion about how to prevent mass shootings and violence and things like that. What?
This relates to what we talked about earlier in the week about mental illness. Okay, because what we're saying here is how can we predict that somebody will be a mass shooter? Right. We need to improve that because it relates to that other issue of how do we keep guns out of the hands of individuals with mental illness.
Or out of the hands, right. I think out of the hands of people with mental illness or out of the hands of people who could become a potential shooter. Those are two different
Either
things.
one is okay. Because as we've been saying for 2 weeks now, there is this debate going on every time there's a mass shooting. We have this debate about what's the cause. Is it violent video games? Is it mental illness? Is it okay? So we talk about all these things. So we talk about how do we identify who's mentally ill so that they don't get a gun. We talk about how do we predict who might do a shooting if they don't get a gun. But we're not allowed to talk about guns. We're not allowed to have a discussion about gun control.
Right.
Okay, we can talk about mental illness and we can talk about prediction. We can talk about video games. We can talk about Hollywood. We're not allowed to talk about what about guns?
Right.
No. That's Second Amendment.
Right.
Not allowed to touch that. And that's mainly from the extreme end of the NRA. We know that now, that there's an extreme end of the NRA, and they're pushing that agenda. Most people now realize that we have to have a discussion about guns. So this today's podcast is about, can we predict? Is there any way that we can predict who might be a mass shooter?
Should I go ahead and just give the answer?
No.
That is the answer.
What? How do we predict? Oh, you tricked me.
Oh, gotcha.
You can't predict.
You can't predict. You these kinds of events, these kinds of traumatic experiences are completely unpredictable. What?
No, it bothers me because when we talk about prediction, we're talking about formulas.
Right.
Okay? We predict based on putting all the information into an algorithm.
A regression formula.
Putting all the information into some kind of formula.
I like those formulas,
and that
by the way.
formula gives you an answer. Okay?
Yeah.
So let's say weather. Okay? We take all these factors that we know about that are related to certain weather events.
Right.
We put them into a computer model. You've all heard this when you listen, especially if you live in Florida with hurricanes.
Right.
We have these prediction models, okay?
Spaghetti models.
Right. And so there's a likelihood that it's going to go in this direction or this direction. It's a likelihood that it's going to snow. I lived at a time when the people would predict the weather and say, it's going to rain today. Now they say there's a 60% chance that it's going to rain. There's a 40% chance that I might be wrong. I'm just saying it might rain today.
Right.
Okay. These are statistical formulas that we plug information into. We're not very good at predicting the weather.
Right.
A lot of times there's a 60% chance of rain and it doesn't rain.
Right.
There's a 90% chance of rain and it doesn't rain. Well, there was a 10% chance that it wouldn't.
Yeah.
So even something with variables like the weather.
I like it when it's raining and they say there's a 60% chance it's going to rain. It's like, wait a minute, it is raining.
There's a chance of rain today.
How does that happen?
There's a 100% chance. If I was a weatherman, I'd get on and say, it's a 100% chance of rain today. So remember that when we talk about prediction, we're talking about statistical formulas, and we plug data, numbers into those statistical formulas, and we let a computer crunch all those numbers, and then the computer says, yes, this person or this event. Now, if we can't predict the weather,
Right.
human behavior is far more complex than the weather. So if we can't really if we don't have a way to predict the weather, the chance it's far less likely that we're going to be able to predict human behavior because it's so much more complex.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of articles that we've pulled some information from. One is from The Conversation, and one is from a website called Vox.com. And they both are really good for different reasons.
Right.
But the one from Vox, what I really like about it is it has these images that go with it, sort of these
I love the cartoons.
images that go with it to demonstrate sort of the probability.
Right.
Because, we can create as sophisticated a formula as possible. We can take all the information from the FBI and from the different investigation organizations and from mental health professionals and medical professionals and criminologists and the court system and all of these places. We can take all that information and put it into a formula. And even if that, and this is the example they use, even if that formula is 99% accurate.
Well, I have a question. And they pose it in the article. And by the way, if you're interested in can we predict, this is a real good article to read because it's very easy to understand. But it's not real technical. It's fun to read. They have these little cartoons throughout. If I could say to you, I have a way to predict with 99% accuracy who the shooter is going to be. Would you like that? Would everybody?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We'd all buy that, wouldn't we? Okay. If I could get to there's a 99% chance that I'm right. Okay? Everybody would say, absolutely, let's do it tomorrow. Let's see what 99% accuracy really means, though.
Right.
Okay? Let's look at the numbers.
Right. So if you're 99% accurate, that means if 100,000 people go through that machine, and it identifies
that machine being my way of predicting
the formula, right?
Okay. So
and 100,000 people go through it. 1% is going. 1% of them will be a shooter.
Will be a shooter,
even though they were identified as not being a shooter. Because it's 99% accurate means that when there's 1% error. All right.
So, which means it's going to identify 1,000 who are shooters.
Right. And so, as you extrapolate that out.
Right. What does that mean? See, he's sort of like he does computers and statistics, and he talks like he has that vocabulary. Tell them what you mean by extrapolate out.
Okay. So if we take the 100,000 and we would have identified
1,000 shooters.
1,000 shooters. And then we expand that out to, I use a different word.
Thank you.
To the entire population.
320 million.
Right.
Okay.
Let's see, he has a little graphic here.
3.2.
I'm got to get way down to it.
There it is.
Yeah. There would be 3.2 million potential killers.
That's right. Again, let me say again. This is 99% accuracy.
Right.
And if a politician got up today and said, I have a formula. I've been working with these guys from Lakeland, Florida, and they developed a formula.
Is that us?
That's us. And they developed a formula, and they can predict with 99% accuracy who the shooters are going to be.
Right.
You want to do that? Absolutely. Let's get an NIH grant. Let's fund these guys because 99% accuracy, we don't get that we don't even get that with the weather.
Right.
Okay?
So if it identified 1%,
that's what 99% accuracy means, that we're going to miss it 1% of the time. Okay, so we're going to identify 3.2 million potential shooters.
Right. Now, that is error because there's not 3.2 million shooters.
Of course, and so something's wrong somewhere.
Right.
Okay, so 99% looked really good until you sit back and see what that means.
Right.
And what it actually means is you have 3.5 million people. Okay, 3 million people who are shooters. Well, we know we don't have 3 million people who are shooters.
Right.
So, and how do you get, you can't get 99% accuracy.
Right.
In anything. You can't get it with the weather.
Right.
Okay. And so how could you possibly get it with human behavior, which is so much more complex?
Right. So again, just to kind of whittle that down, because I think it feels complex, even though it's not really complex.
Right.
99% accuracy means that, if you take 100 people,
Right.
it's going to be wrong 1% of the time.
Right.
And being wrong means that it could identify somebody as being a potential shooter when they're not.
When they're not.
Okay. So if you extrapolate it out,
right,
to the entire population, it can be wrong 1% of the time. Wrong means incorrectly identifying a person as a potential shooter.
That's right.
1% of the U.S. population is 3.2 million people.
If we're wrong about the weather 1% of the time, it rains when you didn't expect it to.
Right.
If you're wrong 1% of the time here, you're denying somebody a fundamental right.
Right.
Okay. That's a very big difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think that there's any politician who is going to know. Well, not that there's not a politician, because there's politicians who bring snowballs into Congress and say that this is proof that there's not global warming. There aren't enough politicians that would be behind a bill that would say, let's take the Second Amendment away from 3.2 million people. And he has the graphic on here is 3.2 million. That's about the equivalent to the population of Oklahoma.
It's a state, right. It's the population of Oklahoma.
Right. So it's not going to happen.
Right. So, and the other thing when you talk about prediction, we don't know how to do that very well with humans. There are only two reliable characteristics, correlates. They're young.
Being young.
And they're men.
Being men.
But then again, you're thinking, okay, these are young men, teenagers, young adults. Okay, but if you look at the numbers a little more carefully, which is what we're advocating here,
right?
50% of the shooters are older than 30. So even though young and male are the two most reliable predictors, in fact, half of the shooters are over 30. 12% are younger than 20. So actually, it's not a majority who are doing. It's not a majority of young people doing the shooting.
Right.
Okay? And 38% are between 20 and 29. So in fact, they're not just teenagers. And then you have the other, when we talk about putting data into the formula, when we mentioned that earlier, well, what kind of data do you put in? Well, you put in these human characteristics. Right. What are the characteristics of shooters? Okay, the characteristics of shooters are depression, resentment, social isolation, blaming others, fascination with violent entertainment, and a significant interest in weapons. Okay, those are the characteristics that are most often associated with mass shooters. Do you know anybody who has those characteristics?
A few people.
Yeah. Well, many people are depressed, resentful, like weapons. So again, you can't use these because most people who have these exact characteristics are not shooters.
Right.
Okay. So even the correlates, even the things that correlate most highly, being young and male, being depressed, feeling resentment.
Right.
How do you explain all the people who have exactly these same characteristics who don't shoot?
Right.
There's something different about the shooters, and we just don't know what that is.
Right.
So you can't predict.
Right.
Because we don't know what the factors are.
Exactly. And, it's statistics work wonderfully one direction, but don't necessarily work well the opposite direction. Right. It works really well when you're looking at this group of people who did something and saying, what are the characteristics of these people? Right. But it's a completely different process to take those characteristics and apply it to a larger population. Because I feel like I want to get into research.
These prediction models that we use in science are good for large groups of people. They're good for, people who are first generation. They're good for people who are Catholics.
Right.
Okay, you take large groups of people and you plug those data into the computer and it's a little more reliable. These prediction models are not good for tiny populations.
Right.
They just don't work very well for tiny populations.
In research, we would just say that the sample size was too small.
It's too small. You take these 3.2 million people, these shooters, okay? That's just a fraction, a tiny fraction of the whole population. And we're looking at a smaller number than that when we say, who are the shooters?
Right.
The prediction models my model, Berney and I developed this model, 99% accurate. But it doesn't work for this tiny group of shooters,
right?
Okay? Because if you had 3.2 million shooters, then you get some reliable information. But if you have 300 shooters, there isn't enough information there to make predictions.
Right.
Okay. So the only way we have to make predictions doesn't work when we're dealing with very small numbers like 300.
Right.
Okay. So the system doesn't work.
Yeah.
What we're probably looking for, and you and I said this the other day, when we talk about trying to figure out what the issues are, we said it's not mental illness.
Right.
Remember, we said that. There's something else at work here. And we need to also look at the stressors and the triggers because the characteristics of the shooters are common among millions of people.
Right.
What is it that triggers some and not others?
Right.
And we just don't know. Okay?
Right.
There was one article that I think we may be posting it. I think it's in here about what is it about the United States that why are we have the same number of assaults, we have the same number of aggressive behavior, we have the same as any other country in the world. The only place we're different is in deaths. Okay, there are more deaths in our country, and some people say, well, it's because if you're in the UK and you have too much to drink, you go outside and you get into a fight. If you do that in New York, somebody's going to have a weapon.
Right.
And so that's the group saying it's the weapons that are causing it. But I don't know whether we have that graphic or not. If not, I can get it.
Yeah.
About the spike in, and maybe in the other article, about the spike in. No, that's not it. But you can see the graph where all the bars are the same across countries.
Right.
Until you get to deaths, and then suddenly the United States is in a different category.
Right.
And so what's the difference? We have a lot more weapons in this country.
Yeah.
And fights turn deadly.
Right. Right. Yeah. So again, the bottom line is you can't predict the unpredictable. These are unpredictable events, and the best we can do is look. You look for the immediate acute signs. You look for the immediate threats, and you prepare, you prevent as best you can in those acute type settings. But there's no way, and from when we think about research, again, we're talking about sample sizes and everything. The sample of people that are shooters, they may come from a population, a subpopulation that we haven't yet identified.
Right, that's right.
If we could identify that subpopulation, then we may be able to be a little bit more capable of predicting some of these things. But we don't know what that subpopulation is.
And that's why we have to do the research. What we've been saying all week is when you listen to people on TV, and I don't care what station you listen to. We have Fox and we have MSN, we have everything in between, and whatever you read, it doesn't matter. When you hear people offering solutions, be very, very careful, because in fact, it's not mental illness, it's not violent video games. We really don't know yet what the differences are, and we need to study it. And when you get things like the Dickey Amendment, which is the one that said 22 years ago that said the CDC is not allowed to study anything that might advocate gun control. Right. When you get those sorts of limitations, then you can't do the kind of research we need to do.
Right.
So at this time in our history, if the politicians would stop making recommendations, whether it's to arm teachers or gun, I don't care which issue it is, let's make sure. We've had so many false starts in this country, zero tolerance and different things. Let's make sure that we identify what the problem is. We know as much as we can know. Okay, we can't. We just today we said you can't predict. Okay,
Right.
so let's take what we do know. And let's try to solve the problem thoughtfully, not
Right.
quickly. Let's solve it thoughtfully.
Right. And just to throw out, to tie in what you were saying with the issue of population and subpopulation and sample, is a subpopulation that they're focusing on is the mentally ill. A subpopulation that they're focusing on is, those who play violent video games. And again, that it's what we're doing now, what we're proposing now, doesn't fit. That subpopulation isn't really at fault. If we think about mental illness as the subpopulation, 20%. Remember, 20% of the population has a mental illness.
60 million people.
Right. So if 60 or so million people have a mental illness, and we're talking about 300 shooters, once again,
How do you pick 300 out of 60 million?
there's no way.
You want to talk about a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, it's just not going to, that math isn't going to work. There's no formula that's sophisticated enough to do that. You would have to continue to whittle down that subpopulation to figure out, okay, it's these people, a significant portion or a predictable portion of this group of people. These are the ones that are at risk for shooting, and we don't know what they are.
It was as I was doing the research for this morning's for today's podcast, inadvertently ran into an article. Maybe it's individuals with autism who are doing these shooting, and I thought, how sad that somebody would even raise that as the boy at Sandy Hook. Yes, Adam Lanza, he had a diagnosis, but that's the problem with this issue right now. It became politicized by the extremes, and we're rushing to judgment. Our governor did it. Our president is doing it. They're rushing to quickly do something because it's politically expedient, but it's not going to answer the complicated questions that mass shootings.
It's not going to get us where we really need to be.
Right.
So, all right, that's it for today.
What day is today?
You know what day it is.
I know, but what day is it? Really?
We're recording on Wednesday.
See,
but this is going out on
for
Friday.
me, there's real day and there's podcast day.
Yeah.
So the real day is.
You have to hold both in your head at the same time.
Oh. So.
All right, that's it for today.
Challenge.
Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.
Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.